WoW is overly complex today, and it's keeping new players from coming into the game. Raids require too many weak auras and add-ons to help you react to mechanics. Classes need a degree in physics, experience in engineering, and the ability to stick a cylinder block into a square hole with your eyes closed, somebody else's hand, from 5 feet away without speaking the same language or being from the same planet. It gets a bit too much, and although for long-time players the added level of death is refreshing and challenging, sometimes it can be taken too far. So let's see where WoW went too far with the complexity. Starting simple and where most people take their first steps, leveling. For a new player, all I have to say is good luck. You'll be shoved into Battle for Azeroth for some reason, which has no transition into the Dragonflight story whatsoever. To be fair, neither the Shadowlands, and this is a byproduct of the devs wanting to get rid of that storyline ASAP. But that doesn't make it easier for new people to understand what the hell is going on, what is World of Warcraft, and what does leveling have to do with playing the new expansion. Since WoW has soon 20 years of story and expansions, it will be harder and harder to make them relevant, and leveling has stopped being relevant probably in the first expansion, when the game became all about the end game and max level. So long as end game starts at max level and all the actual content starts at max level, leveling will only be a means to an end, which doesn't help people that they acquire close to no benefit from leveling outside maybe the last 10 levels they do in Dragonflight that starts them with the reputations, professions, and world exploration, and even that is me being incredibly generous here. The best solution for this is something we already have, and that is Exile's Reach, the alternative to leveling that people can take on their second character onwards. If this mode can be made to take you from level 1 to 60 or whatever the new expansion's level start will be, while explaining to people what dungeons and raids are, how professions work, how forming groups and getting into guilds is, it can solve a lot of barriers of entry for new people. The current gearing system is too complex for new and existing people as well. You have 6 total item types from Explorer to Adventurer, Veteran, Champion, Hero, and Myth, and all can be upgraded using currencies, which there are a total of 5 of. Both the currencies and the gear can be obtained from multiple sources, with higher difficulty rewarding higher item level enabling rewards. The issues start when a lot of this is gated, and it also overlaps to the point where you need a spreadsheet to keep track of it. We made a gearing video to get your alts to 480 item level, and the simplest advice we could give people is to just do plus 18s and bypass 90% of the gearing issues in terms of item types, currency types, and vault rewards. When that is the solution to your gearing system, ignoring the majority of the content, then we have a problem. Why not just get rid of the item types entirely and leave currencies in charge of what eye levels you can upgrade? You can make it so only aspect crests get the items to the highest item level, and the aspect crests can only be looted from mythic raids and plus 18s or higher. That way, players don't need a subscription to Microsoft Office for their Excel portfolios when it comes to gearing. There's no good enough reason that I have to loot the same item in 3 or more variations and use 3 or more different currencies from 2 to 3 drop locations to reach the end goal of getting the best gear I can. Item level, Explorer, Adventurer, Veteran, Champion, Hero, Myth, Flightstones, Whelp Crest, Drake Crest, Worm Crest, Aspect Crests, and these enchanted for crafting professions, which I'm not even gonna touch. Too much. It's just too much, and it's not interesting. If you want to raid on Heroic or Mythic, better be prepared with a list of add-ons that can make the fights possible, or at least not a total pain in the ass, for your group. This has been a back and forth topic for a while. People made weak auras to make boss fights more efficient, and the devs made boss fights harder to challenge people using weak auras, which in turn made more complex weak auras to make the fights more efficient, turning future raid designs into even more complex 3D chess problem-solving minigames. Not sure who has to give here, but we got to a point where Mythic Niltarion was a fight that used the weak aura to showcase the layout of the boss room you were in, where the walls were, and where you had to go depending on what mechanic was happening. When an add-on starts telling you how to play the game, we have a problem. Obviously, not everyone gets to clear end raid bosses like Mythic Niltharion, but this is an extreme example of how much of the fight is being played by colors and shapes on your screens, and how much by not you making decisions. Some people could likely play the fights without add-ons, but they would have to not play with their friends that cannot do the same. And sometimes even playing without add-ons or weak auras becomes incredibly inefficient when you have to have reaction times to mechanics that cannot span more than a second long. That's not necessarily new to gaming, but I don't believe that's something that has a place in WoW. Sure, difficulty can exist, but there has to be a line you draw where that difficulty forces people to use add-ons and weak auras or not be able to engage with the content because they don't have the reaction time of a 17-year-old. The difficulty in raiding was always mostly in getting all 20 or so people to do the same thing, even if it was a simple thing, and not as a big of a focus on individual skill level, which take us to the second big issue with raiding. Too many mechanics, mostly complex ones, put a lot of responsibility on a singular player, which more often than not becomes a do-or-die mechanic where if failed, the entire raid wipes. That is not fun and definitely pushes using external help to be able to assign people to the mechanic and making sure it will be done properly. We need fewer mechanics that target individual players, which if they die, wipe the rest of the raid. That severely limits new people getting into raiding and adds to the necessity of weak auras and other add-ons being used. Constant scaling content is fun, but added affixes that forces you to play a different game is not. And I'm talking about situations where you have to do your rotation for your class and then stop engaging with the pack or your party and then swap your attention to this other thing instead. Inherently, that's not really bad, but also not the reason I am here in the dungeon, I mean. If I am a DPS, I am there to kill monsters, not ruin my rotation synergy, dash across the room to handle this one thing that's an obstacle, then go back to what I was doing. If it's a dungeon mechanic, that's fine, but when you add affixes on top of those dungeon mechanics already, it stops being fun and becomes an extra layer of mechanics I need to handle. It's not about skill here, it's not hard to dispel an afflicted ghost. It's, however, annoying when I have to change my talent in a self-harming way to bring a utility that wasn't made naturally available to me by the spec's design and use it in the middle of my potion bloodlust and 3 seconds left of my snapshot window, completely gimping my damage performance for the next 2 minutes, which is the main reason I am here to begin with. I am all for dungeons being designed so classes can use their utility kits to handle problems, but the way these problems are implemented feel forced and unnatural, causing obligatory friction that a lot of people like to classify as difficulty with a just get good solution. Play Cuphead, guy. Do the Valkyries in God of War on the highest difficulty if you want a skill challenge, and let me do my Deathmark window on my Assassination Rogue in peace. Incorporeal and Afflicted are some of the worst affixes added and the best examples for this. Although boring and gatekeeping, Fortified, Tyrannical, Bursting, Bolstering, Raging are mostly fine. Still need some look at, of course, as all affixes do, but better than the stop healing your party, stop dispelling poisons from your party and deal with this other non-dungeon thing instead. The spells get ridiculous on bosses like the Throne of the Tides Shaman boss, when you have Afflicted to be dispelled and you are already juggling one dispel on your party for one of the 2 Flame Shock debuffs, spot healing the other dispel because you don't have 2 dispels, and a third unexpected dispel pops and nobody in the party can handle it. This limits the composition of groups that can clear the content in that very moment. Some of these affixes are annoying in low keys, making me feel like I have to stop playing WoW and do them instead, and on higher keys it makes classes like Evokers mandatory to cover the lack of utility other classes have or don't have, for their gatekeeping classes and specs from clearing higher content in a world where we want players to feel like their spec contributes to the value of the group. Overall, affixes are a problem, but for the sake of the video we will only talk about the complicated part, which ends up as an annoyance and not a fun obstacle to overcome for a 2 in 5 chances of looting 1 in 9 items at the end of the dungeon if you get it in time. For the most part, specs are getting better and better at being designed and feeling nice to play, but the fact that all specs require guides to play properly is still bad. It is a touchy line between death and simple since not one formula is 100% correct, but there are outliers that take it too far. Arcane Mage, for example, has a complex rotation that's incredibly pretentious about who you target and how you target, what buttons you press, and how many of them you press. Combat often forces you out of your rotation and nukes your performance. If we're going to have complex specs, for which I am an advocate, then we have to make them less punished by combat design to the point of people being better off respecing two alternatives. Brewmaster. Hard to play and rewarding at the same time, which is fine, but the button bloat is too much. A lot of the buttons don't have a lot to do with the spec tanking. You can be testy about every bit of tiny DR you get, but with that logic you can justify adding infinite buttons so long as they give a tiny bit of tankiness. It needs to have impactful buttons that function with the kit without turning the spec into a glorified DPS. I'm talking about you, Jadewind. Outlaw Rogue, one of the funnest specs in the game as of today. The burst windows and spammy abilities is what WoW needs a bit more of, but I would be lying to say that this doesn't get exhausting after a while. Not sure how to look at this particular one. I love the spec, and it is one of my mains at the moment because it plays the way it does. But I cannot help but acknowledge that mechanically not everyone can play Outlaw, and maybe that's okay. We should have specs that even button mashers like me can enjoy, while Assassination is a nicer, slower counterpart for rogue lovers that don't want carpal tunnel. But at that point, Assassination needs to be close to evenly balanced so people don't feel forced to play Outlaw, which unfortunately isn't the case, so people do feel forced to play Outlaw, a spec that some of us cannot actually play. And these specs aside, we have too many buffs and procs across the board. It gets hard to keep track of everything that happens with your spec when there aren't enough rows to display your buffs. This gets translated into combat when you have 100 damage events from hits of a few hundred damage each to crits of 700k. It doesn't make sense numbers-wise for my character to do 200k DPS, but still have hits of 3000 or less. What even are numbers at this point? Trinkets, files, weapons all have minor damage procs. Every spec deals a gazillion little damage events that fill the screen with numbers. This makes numbers pointless, makes the screen busy and exhausting to look at. One of the big reasons people prefer Classic, I would imagine, is big hits when you press big buttons. Simple. The best example for this is Balance Druid, which has damage ticks from Moonfire, damage ticks from Sunfire, damage ticks from Astral Smolder, damage ticks from Shooting Stars, damage ticks from Starfall, damage ticks from Mushrooms, damage ticks from Stellar Flare if talented, damage ticks from Starfire Cleave, sometimes damage ticks from tier sets, damage ticks from trinkets or embellishments, damage ticks from Fury of Valoon. On one hand, it's nice to have many ways of dealing damage and many cool buttons to press, but on another hand, I have no idea what any of the numbers on my screen mean, so what's the purpose of even having numbers on screen then? At that point, if the question has to be asked, then there is a flaw in the system. On top of this, all specs require simming and high dedication to research in order to play optimally, and it isn't great. Although sometimes it can be fun, but only to some extent. While it's always a good thing to have super players, the gap today between an average player and a super player is way too big, and this is purely how the specs /spells /talents /gears are built and all the multiple interactions between them. Even the simplest spec cannot be at its best without the use of external tools and websites. The fact that we need weak auras and add-ons in order to play some specs or be able to go through some raid fights or dungeons is just bad. Add-ons and weak auras should be optional and the quality of life improvement, not required to play. I was talking to Marcelian the other day and he remembers being pissed that the game became so easy back in WoD, but now looking back, he had more fun playing it. And it always comes back to the first thing you interact with, your class. Encounters, balancing, comps, and PvP play a big role, and again, it's nice having the space for optimizing and geeking on being a master at your class, but it has to have some limits because I feel today it's just out of control. Blizz needs to take a look at the level of complexity they have in the game and tone it down 10-20%, maintaining a smaller space for optimization but lowering the barrier of entry for decent performance, feedback on what you're pressing. And when you are fine just looking to have some fun in the game, we made a video on the most fun range DPS specs you can check right here if you click it on your screen right now.